this is going to be a monster episode because we're doing, in fact, another deep dive. Before we do, there's just a few things because, Eric, I have to address the people. We are men of the people. We're atop the pyramid, so there is a perspective difference. We're several hundred feet, in fact, above everyone else, gazing down below where they merely resemble ants. Nonetheless, as Ben knows, because Ben's been on here, Ben, my boy, Benjamin Franklin Escrow, has been on multiple times. We like to interact with the audience. Now, Ben, this also wouldn't surprise you. Eric is someone who, depending upon his perspective and how he's feeling on the day, he might say that I objectify him or I say certain things. But it's refreshing to me when I hear other opinions that match my own. In fact, I seek that confirmation. So when I see it, I know there's a trend forming. And we released an episode. So this is the previous episode, Eric, because we're releasing this one on Monday. It's going to be a big takedown on a bunch of different things. Going to be talking pharmacology in this episode. But we had one all about exercise selection. And someone said, if you remember, Eric, in a previous episode all about the peri-workout, intra-workout, and so forth, that the only post-workout window he wants to jump into is the one that leads directly into Eric's bedroom. Someone said that. And I said, it's not me. And I could say that truthfully. And the person, Adam, I'm just going to read his follow-up one, and then we're done with that conversation. He said, "This is the greatest day of my life. Sorry, but not sorry, Eric. I cannot apologize for my God-given drive to violate your personal rights, illegal or not." So first, your quick reaction, because I got one more to read, and then I'm introducing Ben properly, and then we're rolling.
My first reaction is I don't feel safe, right. And I am tired of being objectified. Okay. But once again, please give me a follow, especially as I prepare for next year where I'll be competing in bodybuilding. And I really want to hear your thoughts on my physique as I pose. And just rate it out of 10, much like I will be, getting a rating from the judges at the end of the competition. But don't you dare objectify me.
Right. No, Eric, and that is completely fair because, Ben, I'll just read two more. Another one, it's more, I think it's not just about your physical attributes, Eric, when someone said Eric is a national treasure. So that's just that's a nice, safe compliment. I think you can accept that one, right? We can move on to the final one. Are you going to make this a problem, Eric? Are you going to delay this episode?
I'm just going to say...
Okay.
Is that a comparison to Nick Cage that I just got?
You know what? So we had that pitch, Ben. We did have a pitch over a year ago for our own, what is it? National treasure that no studio wanted to touch for whatever reason. Anyways, final one, and then we're diving into this. Eric, to your point, people hear, obviously, your objections to the being objectified. Granted. And this person said this, Adam, another Adam, and it is seriously another Adam. They just all have Adams are a problem in the iron culture universe. Adam said, Eric is more than an object. He's an attractive object. So, there again, Ben, there's different kind of flavors going on here. Everyone has their own thoughts and opinions. It's just nice to be...
it's bringing back vibes of bodybuilding.com forums back in the day.
That's good. And, this is the type of thing that spurred me on to get into science, so trying to honestly, hopelessly fight against the way I'm seen by society. It's led to personal growth. It hasn't led to any change in my perception. I know to most people, I am just a symmetrical pile of muscles, piled into a Speedo. Yep. And I feel like there's nothing I could have done to change that that direction of my career. Yeah. All I've tried to do is be just a voice, and a source of information without ever even putting myself in that position, but it just keeps coming back to me. So anyway, definitely check me out on stage next year when I'm in that Speedo flexing and trying to get those judges to give me some approval that I greatly need for my soul. And please stop objectifying me, folks. So,
Eric, and now we are going to get to the topic du jour. I do find it interesting, though. That is a nice launching off point where you boys, gents, you are on the bodybuilding.com forums. And it kind of does show a perspective, though, because we were going to do an episode talking about pharmacology, dose, and a lot of different things. And now we're changing it because we had a really productive conversation with Ben, what we'll be covering today. But what I find amazing, and then Eric, launch it for us, bro, is that we refer to this space, or in general, like the evidence-based fitness community or science communicators, like however you want to describe it, right? Cool. And Ben took a survey of the landscape. He's like, yeah, I think this has been covered in pop culture fitness. Like that's that's Ben's. I had to write it down because I'm like, that's a literal quote from Ben. Whereas, oh yeah, more plates, more days, like Jeff Nippert. Like, yeah, so pop culture fitness has covered it. I think what we could do, I was like, damn, Ben. I'm like, we're in pop culture fitness too. Ben's like, yeah, you got, yeah. Like there's Spider-Man, there's you guys, there's all that stuff. I'm like, okay, so we'll do the deep dive here. Shit, we'll do the damn thing.
Yeah, I am honored to be a part of pop culture now. Between Omar's appearance on the History Channel and Ben's labeling of us, and Jeff Nippert and everyone else. So just make sure you at Ben Escrow on all platforms to give him grief for that. No, but in all seriousness, I think this is going to be a really cool episode, really good discussion. And going back to those forum days, and Ben, you're going to know exactly what I'm talking about. The mental gymnastics, hoops, and the deep dives and the strange connections people would make to justify certain supplements they're taking. Like, oh, did you see this mouse study done in China in 1936? That's something similar to what is being sold by this supplement company that's going to get shut down in 6 weeks of selling. I'm buying that shit all the time, right? And it was definitely fueled by the fact that you had... At the time, the way supplements were sold, and like we're talking circa mid-2000s, was that because it was pre the current social media space, is you would get people who would get free supplements or maybe even a small stipend to be supplement reps on the boards. And the supplement companies would specifically choose people who had a high reputation in the bodybuilding.com forum. So competitors, armchair scientists, PubMed ninjas, and people with good physiques or who were known to be posting regularly. And they would, and people like Patrick Arnold had accounts on the bodybuilding.com forums. And so people who are formulators and people with, vested financial interests in supplement companies, and people who had strong anecdotal personal experiences were looking for data to support their experiences to then sell supplements to the masses. And this is something that I was even involved with as a very young lifter in 2005, early on. So, and it was kind of like as a young bodybuilder, you were like, oh, I make it if I get a supplement sponsorship. And this was like the TEDx version of that. Like you have an online account where they send you $50 worth of supplements a month if you put it in your signature and you post about your log of taking, controlled labs creatine or whatever the hell it was. So, I was a controlled labs athlete, 16 years ago. Good times. I just exposed my conflicts of interest. And I mean, that's probably the first time I mentioned controlled labs in 10 years. But nonetheless, I'm not a very good sponsored athlete, but I was one.
You wait a decade until you mention them, Eric. You're doing a great job.
It's that slow burn. It's the slow burn. You got to get the people when they least expect it. And I expect that lab. I don't even know if they're still around to blow up now. So anyway, so as has been talked about by many of the pop culture fitness stars that Ben Escrow has discussed, Jeff Nippert, pop culture. This guy, Turkesterone has kind of taken the hot seat lately. First, through some of, I would say, the less evidence-based crowd as a anecdotally supported thing that is damn near steroid-like. And then more recently, shout out to Jeff, who did a great video discussing the true lack of evidence on it. And I think he did a great job with that. So big shout out to Jeff Nippert. Definitely check out his YouTube video on I think it's called Turkesterone Science Explained. I could be wrong. But essentially what Jeff did, and he had also a longer interview with Dr. Eric Trexler on the Jeff Nippert podcast, and you can find the link to that. It's a really good discussion, and it's essentially like a literature review on the topic. And first off, let's just be very clear. There are no human studies on turkesterone to even base an idea of how effective it is. So the first important point was that Jeff then had to go and look at something similar, ECDY or Ecdysteroid, which is, we're basically talking about bug steroids, folks, is what we're talking about. If you want to get as jacked as a cockroach, then definitely this is the, or an ant, they lift a lot.
We've heard
maybe that's just
20 times their body weight. Come on, dude.
Well, if you have seen the I don't know if you've heard of the series of documentaries by a company called Marvel. I think it's Marvel.
Oh, yeah.
Well, there's a young man from Brooklyn who was bitten by a spider.
Oh.
And now he's extremely strong. I have that on good authority. And then there is also a gentleman who I think who calls himself Ant-Man.
Yeah.
Who I don't know if he's bitten by an ant, or maybe he's just has some technology that makes him
Diminutive in
small.
stature, maybe. I don't know.
He's just very short, but very strong as well. Yeah. So anyway, Jeff did honestly a fantastic job, and he essentially said, okay, well, since there's nothing on turkesterone, we can look at its sibling, ECDY, and covered the studies that are on it. And there's a 2006 study by Wilburn and colleagues that essentially showed in a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial that it and a bunch of other kind of, I don't know, relatively unknown supplements in today's kind of lexicon did really nothing in terms of body composition, affecting anabolic hormones, or affecting performance in the weight room. And then there, I think, was a 2019 paper by Eisman, which did find an effect of ECDY. But really intriguingly, they did a analysis of the supplement, and they found that instead of having 100 milligrams of the active ingredient per pill, there's only 6 milligrams. So any finding or effect that happened in that study, it's really hard to plausibly attribute it to the supplement, considering it had like 1/17 of the active ingredient. So if you were to kind of look at all that, and you were, let's say, a wannabe early adopter of cutting edge supplements, and you want to get everything you can, you might look at that and go, okay, well, worst case scenario then, what we have is an absence of high quality human research on ECDY, but a plausible mechanism, and absence of evidence is an evidence of absence. So I'm going to go ahead and spend that money. And I think that was kind of where things were left with the recent quote unquote pop culture discussion of it, as Ben said, was that, we don't know if this thing works, but none of the current evidence, there's a lack of evidence, and the current evidence is flawed or unsupportive. So there's no reason to take this. But Ben right here, you're not just someone who knows how to read a study. That's child's play. That's some bullshit Eric Helms stuff, just trying to validate himself as more than an object. You, my friend,
Isn't that what we all do, though, ultimately? So if you're guilty, that's so am I.
Well, you were better at it. Let's say that you have an additional skill set. I'm more guilty. Yeah. You have just dove deeper into trying to justify your existence to the benefit of the Iron Culture.
I don't want to derail this, but I'm just gonna have to say it.
Probably.
I think the only way to settle this, gents, you both got to step on stage. I'll be the sole judge, and we're just gonna do a pose down, and we just keep it raw and objective. It's just physiques. You both got big brains. Let me see what those bodies can do.
Once again, Omar, I've told you that if you take a piece of paper and you write the word stage on it and you tape it to your bed, that is not on stage. We've had this discussion multiple times. Anyway, but to put that behind us, no, Ben, in all seriousness, you have an additional skill set. You actually understand the underlying mechanisms because you have training in pharmacology, pharmaceutical sciences. You're not just an RD, you went back to school, just like Rodney Dangerfield, and you have now upskilled yourself to a point where you can speak to the plausibility of these mechanisms. That's something I can't do, and that's something that no one else who's currently talked about this, even though they did a great job, can do. So I thought it'd be really, actually, I didn't think this. You thought it would be really good to come on Iron Culture and talk about it, and Omar and I said, that's fantastic. That's one less thing we have to come up with on our own, and we're not very creative people anymore 3 years into this. So my friend, thank you, and take it away.
I think you covered a lot of ground there. That was a great deep dive beyond just covering the topic of discussion today. But yeah, I think my obsession with these, I guess, nuanced areas, it did drive me to go sort of beyond, and I think it's largely because, number one, I remember, I think we oftentimes carry with us that, younger version of ourselves. And for me, I just remember being a very impressionable, 18-year-old fitness addict and buying into all of the great stories that were told in supplement marketing and wanting to be able to tease out, what was kind of legitimate and what I could rule out. And not having a great framework for that. And I think, everybody kind of has their own motivation in the fitness journey beyond just trying to, get bigger muscles and whatever type of superficial goals might be tied to it. And I think that's one that has always carried with me. Meaning, like, I always find a way to reinvent that, and that's kind of what drives me to go back. Is like there just seems to be a never-ending array of questions, and trying to weed through the bullshit, for lack of a better description. So yeah, I think when this came up, it was fascinating to watch it be covered, especially because this isn't the first time that ecdysteroids have been discussed. I remember, they were kind of a hot topic back probably a decade ago, and at that point, it was ecdysterone that was the main thing being talked about. It wasn't turkesterone. I remember, there was brief mention of that, but I think largely because you couldn't get it, that it probably wasn't talked about. So they marketed what was available, which was ecdysterone. So even back then, I thought it was a pretty fascinating concept. Like, okay, you're telling me that this is an anabolic, yet it works completely independent from any known anabolic pathways. So I guess that might be the best entry point into talking about the pharmacology of ecdysteroids and what's going on.
Yeah, Ben, on that note, just to give people some more historical context, that 2006 study by Wilburn, I think came out probably in response to the fact that it was very popular at that time.
For sure.
Yeah, so that's just kind of give you this idea of the cyclical nature of how things reemerge. And I know there's probably some people who are listening to Iron Culture who were around at that point. But for those of you who were not there for the first cycle, no pun intended, of ECDY, can you just tell us, like, what is ECDY? What is turkesterone? What class of supplements would you call these? Where are they collected and manufactured? And then get into that proposed mechanism and your thoughts about it.
Yeah. So ecdysterone is an ecdysteroid, which is a pretty large class of compounds that are produced by plants. And the reason they're called ecdysteroids is because they're steroids by class, which means they have 17 carbons. They have A, B, C, and D rings. So it's a 4-ring structure made of 17 carbons. That basically qualifies it as a steroid. But I think what's important to know is just because it's classified chemically as a steroid, it doesn't mean it acts like an anabolic steroid in humans. They're actually insect steroids. And the reason that they're insect steroids is that insects have a receptor called an ecdysone receptor that these compounds can bind with, and it actually controls molting. It controls, different functions in insects that mammals just don't have that receptor. So it can't interact with that. So I think, right off the bat, that's a first interesting point where we don't possess the receptor that's classically known for insects. And it does kind of make sense of why these things even exist to begin with is, plants need to protect themselves. They can't run away like we can. They can't really fight. So they sort of defend themselves and fight through chemistry. And basically, at least the current proposed concept of why ecdysteroids are even produced is so they can basically hijack, insect physiology. So obviously, if you can alter behavior or some other function of an insect, you might reduce its chances of eating you. So that's this one way of these. There's actually a large array of plants that produce ecdysteroids. And that just seems to be one of these ways that they protect themselves.
So these are compounds produced by plants that have an impact on hormone receptors in insects.
Correct. Yep.
I just think that's neat.
It is. It's unique. And I think, the other fascinating thing is just to touch a little bit more on things that are steroid by classification. Ecdysteroids are not the only steroids by definition that don't behave like anabolic steroids in humans. Again, because it's a large class. So you can have steroidal structures like things that are in soybeans. Like I don't know how many people know of the history of how we even started synthetically making testosterone, but it's because Mexican yam produces a compound called diosgenin, which has those A, B, C, and D rings that we can actually take as a starting material and then use that to synthetically produce things like progesterone, testosterone, other different...
The marker degradation process, right?
That's exactly what it is. Yep. Yeah, so plants produce phytochemicals or phytosteroids, and it's not something that's necessarily, it's not breaking news, but I think for whatever reason this has, ecdysterone and now turkesterone have stayed around for around 50 years because even looking back in the history, these things, were talked about in like the 80s and 70s with talking about doping for Russian athletes and stuff, using ecdysteroids to try to get, some type of leverage. And actually that 2019 study, which was touched on or really gone through pretty in depth by Jeff, that was, believe it or not, that was a WADA-funded study. So I think it's fascinating to see that there's very interesting history to it, yet we still have not really developed any type of concept on this defined mechanism of how it should be working, yet it's not going away.
Omar, we've talked about this a little bit before on Iron Culture, in reference to some of our supplement episodes with Trexler as well as Esgro here, where not only is it a good idea to try to look at the hierarchy of evidence on supplements, much in the way that I think, Jeff did a great job in that video. Like, hey, we've got this study in 1978, on mouse liver protein synthesis that does not qualify as any kind of evidence for using turkesterone because there's nothing else and nothing in humans. But beyond just kind of looking at the existence of evidence is also, we need to look at the plausible mechanism. And if there is not a plausible mechanism of action, then it's probably not a pathway we should go down, because the interaction between some of the issues with sampling variance, small sample sizes, funded research, publication bias, and we'll just say statistical shenanigans to make something look like a larger effect than it really is, can result in there being some false positives that then get attributed to something that doesn't actually have a mechanism. And if you don't understand the mechanistic side of it, then it's much easier to go, well, I've got that study. I listened to the evidence-based crew. They said, wait till there's a human trial on this. And okay, so I'm going to buy it. But, I think without, like you don't need to become a chemist necessarily. I think you do need to have a basic understanding of some of these things. So for example, there was a study by Mate Munoz, I think, that came out just a couple of years ago. I reviewed it in mass, that suggested that beta-alanine would increase 1RM. And we've talked about beta-alanine in depth on Iron Culture. It has no plausible way of at least acutely impacting, 1RM. And I think that's something that is relatively accessible to people. You don't have to understand, steroid receptors or anything like that. You just understand, oh, this is actually something that helps with buffering. It increases muscle carnosine levels. That acts as a physiological buffer. I can get a few more reps. I don't have as much, metabolic acidosis from training. Therefore, I can do a little more, right? So then you go, okay, well, then why did 1RM go up more in one group than the other? It has to be something that is indirect to that, right? And if you look at the actual paper, you can see there's some funkiness. Like the velocity at 1RM actually increased from pre to post, which is weird. Which, typically velocity, as you get more and more trained, goes down at 1RM as you get better at grinding. So there was something odd with the 1RM test that happened. Also, the way they trained was heavily influenced, or was heavily leveraging fatigue, short rest periods, high reps, and in general, like if that is the stimulus, and you have one group who is better able to handle that because they're supplementing with beta-alanine, and the other group is not, then it's going to make the training program more effective, but you're still comparing two crappy training programs, So like if you have two groups doing reps to failure at 40% of 1RM, and that's not what they did, it's just an example, and one group is able to maybe do a few more reps to failure, yeah, they might get a little more transfer to a 1RM, but that's not saying that beta-alanine is helping them make their 1RM better. I wouldn't recommend it to a powerlifter. It's just saying, yeah, you made a crappy program a little bit better and you had an effect. So anyway, but if you just to look at the raw data on that and the abstract and the findings, you're like, yeah, beta alanine, 1RM went up, placebo group it did not. I'm getting beta alanine for my powerlifting meet, and it wouldn't help you.
I think what's interesting to touch on before we even go into the pharmacology is actually that and how we can take that exact concept that you described to sort of the relative lack of abundance we have for human data on ecdysteroids, and basically the weakness of looking at just the abstract and the conclusion and making this major jump and saying, okay, I'm buying this product because it seems to work. And I think it does lie in that methodology, which we talked about kind of prior to recording, which was the earlier studies. I forget, you said 2009. Did look at 06. They did look at ecdysteroids and found no impact. And then this more recent one in 2019, it did. And what are the methodological differences in those? And I think a large one is, they looked at markers of changes in body composition through very different methods, and ones we know cannot be taken as equivalent. Meaning, like in the I'm sorry, I keep getting the date. The 2006 one.
Yep.
2006 it was. Yeah. So they used DEXA for looking at body composition changes, and then the newest one they looked at bioelectrical impedance, and there's many shortcomings that come with that, and that could be a large factor in them seeing that there was this big change in body composition that may not have actually been there. So I think exactly what you described is, applies perfectly to this situation as well.
Yeah, and I just can't reemphasize enough the fact that the recent study from 2019 that did find an effect, I almost think, because it was WADA funded and because the recommendation from the paper is we should consider banning like ECDY, right. Like that's probably driving some of the hype, but they only found 1/17 of the active dose versus what was claimed. Like they did an assay of the supplement. It had 6 milligrams per pill when it was supposed to have 100 milligrams. So my thoughts when I read that and the author's conclusions, I'm like, so do you think it's actually 17 times more powerful than or do you think you had some random sampling variance? So yeah, that comes down to the question for you is like, could we even plausibly expect this thing to basically be like DECA mixed with Anavar?
So if we, touching on the quality control aspect first, I think is another major reason to be skeptical, which is, again, it's pretty much bluntly stated right in that study, but I think other ways to determine quality control issues within the market that just kind of echo exactly what's happening here is a lot of these companies say they're selling 95% turkesterone extracted from XYZ plant, spinach or whatever else, or selling these high potency extracts, but it's a brown powder. So the reality is if something is above 90% purity, unless it's a well-known colored compound, it's going to be white, and turkesterone is white. So the reason I could say that without just making it up out of thin air is if you go to the website that sells all these compounds that are externally validated to research institutions called Sigma, they sell standards for ecdysteroids. They sell ecdysterone, they sell turkesterone. Just as an aside, if someone is looking to try to get stuff from there, you're not going to be able to, because you need to be at a research institution, A, and B, you wouldn't be able to afford it. They're like thousands of times more expensive than buying something on the regular market would. So I'm gonna deflate that one immediately. But you can look at actually the analysis of these, both the COAs and the SDS sheets, and they show that they're white or off-white powders. So I think that's one criteria immediately is if someone is selling a purported high potency extract and it's a brown powder, immediately that you're not getting what you think you are. So I think that was a really fascinating point. Aside from the pharmacology, just on a quality control aspect, that these are definitely not what is being sold.
It's stuff like that, which is why I love that we get you on, Ben, because I don't know that. I don't know what color turkesterone is. I mean, come on, you know? So here's the thing is, you know, based upon our kind of preliminary convo before we jumped on this call, it sounds like, based upon your understanding of the receptors and the proposed mechanism, that even if these pills had 100 milligrams, you don't think it would have a plausible rationale for actually acting anabolically and improving performance. Can we talk about that? Can we dive into why you think there's reason to suspect the entire class of compounds as ergogenic for humans?
Sure. So we'll start at known anabolics and why they work. So the most classical ones, usually what things are measured against, is either testosterone or DHT. And the reason those are anabolic is because they interact with the androgen receptor. So basically, they get absorbed into the blood, they make their way to the cell, they pass through the cell membrane, they dock to the androgen receptor. That actually goes downstream. It basically changes the way you make new proteins. So it works very directly on transcription and translation of new proteins. There's actually some offshoot mechanisms that occur from that as well, like interactions with glucocorticoids, like cortisol, which actually, if people are aware of a lot of the purported roles of testosterone, not just making new proteins, but being also an anti-catabolic, that's why. So anyway, that all basically comes downstream of interacting with the androgen receptor. So one of the things that is clearly stated and really validated with any receptor binding studies that they've done with ecdysterone is that it doesn't interact with the androgen receptor. So we can pretty much take that one off the list automatically. And a lot of these markers that they look at in the studies that we do have, they look at serum hormones and they don't change. So no changes in estradiol, no changes in testosterone, no changes in LH or IGF-1. So nothing seems to back up that it's working on these known anabolic mechanisms. So I think the first question then is, okay, are we going to rediscover some new mechanism with ecdysterone that we haven't figured out in the past 100 years of really in-depth pharmacological studies? So one of the things you're able to do when you're trying to define a mechanism, which is much easier to do both in collecting subjects and with passing, an IRB, is you can study it in cell cultures. So you can basically put in a small amount of whatever raw material, whatever ingredient, and put it in isolated muscle cells and see if it changes. You basically have a growth medium in there that feeds and keeps these cells alive, and then you co-incubate it with it, and you could see if it's changing anything. And interestingly, one of the things they have shown both in this most recent study and prior ones is that it does seem to increase the size of myotubes. So like what's the word I'm looking for? Pre-fully developed muscle cells. And I think that's fascinating, but we can also see, okay, well, that seems to be happening. Let's put it in let's isolate certain receptors, put it in, and see if any of these things dock to those receptors. And what they have found is that it seems to bind to the estrogen receptor, specifically the beta subtype. So that's really fascinating because we know of many agonists, so basically compounds that activate, they bind to a receptor and they activate it, so they, quote, turn it on. So basically, to rewind a little bit, you can have really two effects when you dock to a receptor. You can act as an agonist, which means you turn the receptor on, and then you can act as an antagonist, which means you don't shut it off, but you don't allow the thing that would typically turn it on from interacting. Yeah, exactly. So they've shown that turkesterone and ecdysteroids do interact with the estrogen receptor beta, and they seem to turn it on. So if we stop there, then people might say, okay, well, a mechanism is proposed now. Like this is enough for me. Like it should be working. The next step is we know many other agonists that exist that are actually highly potent and selective and specific for that receptor, and none of them have any dramatic impact, really any notable impact on either performance enhancement or muscle size. So two really well-known ones are genistein and camphorol, and they're both flavonoids, so they're things that are in the normal diet. Like if you eat fruits and, well, if you eat vegetables, if you eat beans like soybeans, like those compounds are both in there. And I just find it interesting that we haven't seen this explosion of research for those causing muscle mass increases and performance enhancement like we're seeing with ecdysteroids, or even explosion in sales of them. The irony is most people tend to avoid them because they're worried about phytoestrogens and having, gyno or estrogenic effects from eating too much soy. So I think it's very fascinating that the proposed mechanism for this and saying that it's anabolic because of this is associated with things that we've never before associated with anabolism or performance enhancement. So basically, if it's working through that, it is going to completely reframe our understanding of the estrogen receptor beta and muscle mass.
It sounds like you're saying the very people online who call other people soy boys are now taking a supplement, because, those are totally the same dudes who would jump on the turkesterone bandwagon, that are actually making themselves soy boys, and they think that's a good thing. So would you say that the soy boy culture is actually infiltrating us through the anti-soy boy culture? This is coming.
Yeah, it's the reckoning. It is the great reckoning.
Ben, I'll say just real quick, man, before we do the deep dive, I'm sure while you're elucidating this for the Iron Cult, you can't help but wonder, and that's maybe why he calls the rest of us, Eric, and I can handle this, okay? Pop culture fitness. Just because this, I'm going to go off on this, and I want you to continue, though, because I want us to get slightly speculative in terms of the potential mechanisms to have not only the principle of charity, as Eric would say, but to steelman the shit out of any potential argument of anyone who's trying to endorse, talk about, or recommend, anything that we're talking. Because I do find it curious, the bigger proponents of turkesterone or any of these things are the very ones that have discount codes or vested interests in it doing well. That surely, Eric, is not related at all to their passion for promoting it, the fact that they directly make monetary compensation from promoting it. It's more a public good and service to others, that they're just that jazzed about it that they want to tell others, right? I think that's, first off, pretty plausible. I don't know what you think.
I think that's generally the way the fitness space has always operated, out of a place of community-oriented, helping one another, building people up, rather than making them feel like they're not enough.
Yep.
All the good-hearted Globo gyms out there who tell you, you're broken, we can fix you. What they really mean is, I love you unconditionally, and you don't have to be here, but I'm really glad you are.
Love languages. Everyone has a different one.
Yeah, absolutely.
But actually, for both of you guys, here's my question for you, and I'm going to go off the rails here. But does it annoy you when you see in the public space, so those with the highest platforms, biggest platforms, or the biggest voices, when they are either saying things that are blatantly untrue, downright potentially harmful, or misconstruing what the current available science is? And I will say, because guess what, Eric, we're never appearing on that show, the Joe Rogan Experience, where he spoke about when he's talking about either like carbohydrates or like I have, where it's always veiled in things like it's an anecdote, right? But it's like almost the cultural mythos that you hear inside of it that people want. It's the inner desire of what they want to hear to be true. My diet failed. Well, your diet failed because you're following a Western diet. Well, you need to follow instead as the carnivore diet, or so on and so forth. Oh, steroids. Like, you think, Ben, to your point about ecdysteroids or turkesterone, or like even like, yeah, it's a proposed mechanism. It's like, well, we don't have enough research. Well, I know people that are using it now. I mean, the research is in there, so who's to say? So they're in this like nebulous cloud. So they use it's like a chimera where they use the not knowing, so they could state something, it not come back to them to be harmful, and then they could talk about it on the biggest level. So I'm thinking of either fitness channels, or I am thinking about, honestly, when I say Joe Rogan in various levels, various things that he's talked about throughout the years, that you could have, like, shout out to Lane as an example. He had Lane on, and Lane's like trying to explain to him, this is how things work, right? Like, here's CICO, and Joe's like, huh. Yeah, I mean, I just think that's interesting. Like, he's not buying it. It's like when you have, you see, let's say it doesn't matter, CNN, Fox News, and you'll have like a climate, a scientist, and then you'll have a political lobbyist on the other side, and they're giving an equal platform, and then the commentator by the end of it's like, well, you both brought up really great points. One person brought up the science, the other brought up a bunch of word salad. We're going to have to think about that. So I'm just wondering now to dial it back, because as Ben starts talking about theoretically no plausible mechanism, the house of cards kind of seems like it's falling apart. Not to say that's all the way down, but it's falling apart. But if you're just to listen to the cultural zeitgeist of what's going on right now, that's not the narrative. So I'm just wondering, from both of your perspectives, this is the question. Does it either annoy you? Does it make you lose faith in humanity? I'm joking when I say that. Or do you think that nothing like there needs to be regulations or whatnot, that we're doing exactly what we need to? We're talking about it. We're trying to amplify the important conversations. But yeah, considering that you've made this both of you your career, you're intensely passionate about this. You actually do this because you give a fuck. Does it ever annoy you when you see some of these things occur?
It used to annoy me. It still does annoy me, I'll be honest. Like, after, I think the one that really was like, I can never listen to this podcast again, was when they had Stephen Guyenet and Tobbs on Joe Rogan. And like, he's like, meta-analysis, randomized controlled trial, meta-analysis, randomized controlled trial. Here are logical fallacies. Here's, what happens when you leave out evidence. Like, he built an extremely solid case, and then, Tobbs did his Tobbs thing. And afterwards, Joe Rogan was basically like, well, I don't know who to believe. And I was like, okay. That was, so it made me realize that, Joe Rogan platforms non-experts all the time, but it's not because he has a vested interest or he's getting money. He's not like a charlatan. I think there has not been the right kind of education for him or most people to help them evaluate evidence. And also the way that information is given out online exacerbates the problem, because it caters to an ever lowering attention span. So what that's made me, what the reason why I say I'm not mad about it anymore is because that's made me go, all right, so what do we need to do better as educators? And I think that type of conversation and the result of it, and how it has had a very minor effect in the general populace, but it continues to educate those other people who are already educated or already think skeptically, has made me lean more into not just like playing the whack-a-mole game of busting myths, or, putting out, very scientific information to other science-interested people, but trying to also give people tools on how to think more critically. Like, an example would be the meta conversation in this podcast itself. The message here, folks, if you're listening, is not you need to learn the how beta agonists, how estrogen agonists and antagonists work at the cellular level. No, it's to understand that there has to be a proposed mechanism, and then you need to evaluate that mechanism, or you find someone who does. Right? You become resourceful. So instead of maybe the surface level kind of evidence-based lesson of show me a human study, not an animal study, show me an outcome we care about, not a proxy, make sure it has enough sample. Like, that's all great, don't get me wrong. But there is just another tool that we're essentially trying to give. So I've moved from the way I used to do things towards trying to give people more tools and trying to give them more agency. I don't know how effective it is, but there's no other way to do it, right? Because you can just play the same game, and then it's just like InfoWars, which I think just creates strife and like tribalism. You get people just, here's my truth, here's your truth, you're evil, I'm good. Right. Especially if it's emotionally charged. That happens a little bit less for like supplements, because people don't typically have an identity attached to a supplement. But you definitely see it in nutrition, which is pretty wild. So anyway, I think you can't just try to be a louder voice. That doesn't do much. You have to try to get people to get new tools related to thinking about things.
Ben?
Yeah, I don't have a heck of a lot to add, because I basically agree with everything Eric said, and I think he's much further along in that process than me. I'd be lying if I didn't say it gets very frustrating, and I think I admittedly am trying to find a better path towards dealing with it as well. One of them is being here to talk. Another one is actually trying to talk more versus before just feeling like I had no voice and people just don't care about it. I'm trying to find a way to communicate that information better and put it out there, even if it reaches 5% of people. I think it's better than 0%. and because I think the reality of the situation, again, a lot of what Eric has already said is like, you're really not incentivized to both go down those rabbit holes and kind of figure those things out because it takes time, it takes effort. But I think even for the people who are providing that, either the marketing or the hype, they're not incentivized either to go and dig a little deeper because ultimately it's going to hurt their bottom line. So I think there's always a line that everybody has, and I think that line is really drawn on what are your priorities. And I think people who are more science-oriented will go down the obsessive why chain a little further versus, if the goal is just, can I push more ecdysteroids, you're going to stop at a certain point if you realize it's going to hurt you from being able to sell harder. So yeah, I think we both have claimed that we know that exists. It's just finding a better way to deal with it that either isn't silence or doesn't become this tribalism, which is putting everybody at war with each other. It's trying to find some type of happy medium. But I completely agree, Eric, and I think you put that very well. Is like to try to be equivalent in how loud your voice can be, or try to drown it out. I have certainly. I don't think any one person can go up against the marketing machine like that. I think maybe you can make inroads, but man, you're talking about taking on a life of constantly fighting, which to me is exhausting.
Well, Eric, Ben, I just want to say, and then we're going to get right back to it. That's why I appreciate what you guys do, and Ben, that's why I love you, man, and what we do with Elemental. I'm not trying to promote. In fact, there's no link in the description, but just like you come from a genuine place, and we can have those conversations of if someone's interested and they want to go to the bleeding edge and they truly want to bring something new, what that looks like. I think what happened with me, just very briefly, when I see someone like a Joe Rogan, and I'm using that because I see who he platforms, particularly I'm talking in the nutrition space or supplements and so on and so forth, is that I do think responsibility scales. And the problem isn't that, you have the wrong answer, is that you're not platforming those with the most education, that are most educated in these topics. You can make the mistake the first time, as an example, like on YouTube, when I had some people that are like physiotherapists or whatnot back in like 2011, and it is kind of a bit of a murky space where some of the research is emerging. And then later, some of that stuff, it's definitely wrong, right? Like I had someone on that now I wouldn't have on. You learn through the process. So I think to me, it's a lack of openness. It's always that desire to be almost counter to the common narrative. So that's like, this is the common diet. Well, of course, like it's already assumed that's wrong. So like, what's going to be right? And the level of evidence necessary for their new like kind of conspiracy theory, to be honest, is woefully lower than their level of evidence required for someone to prove either part of the establishment or just something that is accepted. And so I think it's the lack of openness, and I think it's also the lack of acknowledgement that responsibility to me does scale the larger you get. I remember over a decade ago, I had, and this is the last tangent, and then Ben, we got to go into mechanisms, man. I had this pumpkin challenge, Eric. This is like 2010 or 11. It was the silliest thing in fitness. It was around Halloween. I was just having a good time. It was basically a toss. So who could throw this thing the furthest? But I wanted to make it like fitness oriented. So pumpkin toss. Anyways, so I'm out there. I filmed it and went great. I posted it. And I remember this kid, he filmed the response, and then I saw the video and I contacted him. He decided to do it inside of like a Walmart, like this 16-year-old kid, and like a security guard chased him. And of course the answer is like, like you're not responsible like for that kid. Like, of course, like it's his own action. He decided to do that. And just like maybe what he took away from the message of what I was putting out wasn't as intended, but it's that sometimes the level of fidelity when you're communicating has to be so high. It has to be crystalline. You have to be so clear that there could be no misinterpretation. I'm not saying that kid was my responsibility or what he did, but just that you're an influencer to people. You influence people the way they think, the way they act, the way they perceive the world. And I think it does have a trickle down effect. And that's a very small example. And when you're influencing hundreds of millions of people, man, it gets dangerous. Sorry, go on, Eric.
I didn't know that you also had a pull-ups on flimsy doors moment like I did during the COVID thing, that I had to recant my advice for hoping to not damage people's doors and leave them open to burglary or home invasion. So no, I still still apologize for that 2019 failure. 2020 failure, excuse me.
So it's just amazing to me that like it wouldn't make someone think. Like I think at that point you would be not so scared of saying the wrong thing, but the responsibility would weigh so heavily that you would just, even if you're not a curious, Ben, to your point, individual, like you just want to hear some crazy shit because that's the way your mind works. You want to hear like some cuckoo shit out there. We didn't land on the moon. Like that's your tip right there. That's what you focus on. You're like, man, I better get this right. Not because I could harm a lot of people, but like I don't even know if this is right. As opposed to like, what did you just say? Or what, bug steroids? What did you just say?
Yeah.
So, Ben, let's go. Sorry, man. Let's go back into bug steroids. Let's go back into Starship Troopers here. We're landing here. Talk to me. So you're talking about one of the plausible mechanisms that even if it turned out to be true, wouldn't be anabolic. It wouldn't be promoting anabolism. Can you think now, can we really try and steelman this conversation here, be charitable? Are there any other, from a pharmacology standpoint, mechanism, like things that, not that we're missing, but are pretty theoretical and out there and we would need to expand, but like, maybe there's something out there. Like, can we think about something?
I think if there is, it hasn't been defined yet, so I can only speculate. I think based upon what we know about certain structural requirements of docking at certain receptors, it's pretty obvious that this is never going to be a target, or this molecule will never be the word is ligand, which basically means it's the key that fits into the hole. It will never be that for the androgen receptor. So I don't think we're ever going to find that. Again, like I said, I think that's pretty well established. I think there may be offshoot, like, again, in doing the deep dive for this and trying to find what other things outside of the fitness space have been studied for ecdysterone or ecdysteroids. It seems like they may have a role in things like cancer. And that's one of the things we do know with some of these other phytoestrogens is they do seem to have benefits on estrogen metabolism. So if it is acting at that receptor, that would actually fit to what we know of the other things that are agonists at the estrogen receptor. That's the new receptor. At the estrogen receptor beta, that would actually fit for what we know of other agonists there. So it's impossible for me to say it's not doing anything. I think that's the wrong position. But I think, again, to follow up on everything that we just talked about, I think basically approaching it with a lot more skepticism than belief is sort of my position. I think a few other things to touch on, just, I guess to capstone the pharmacological discussion of it, is it does seem safe. I mean, both of these human studies, they've looked at markers of toxicity. We haven't seen that. So it doesn't seem like anybody's necessarily getting hurt by using these things. But I think if people are still going to buy it, because I know that crowd is still going to exist out there, I think the major thing that people need to do is ask some of these suppliers and manufacturers for better documentation of what it is they're buying. So number one, what we do know about turkesterone is it seems to be most present in the roots. I don't know how to pronounce this genus and species, but it's like Ajuna turkestanica. That's the plant that produces it most. It's most produced in the root. So when you're looking at a label, you should see that as being the part extracted versus just the crude material. If someone is claiming it's a certain percentage of either ecdysterone or turkesterone, ask the manufacturer to produce some documentation that validates that, not a COA, not a certificate of analysis, something that actually validates that's independent analysis that shows that it matches what percentage that they're claiming. To go quickly into what a COA is, it's typically a generic document that any raw material supplier is going to send you when you buy any specific raw material. The limitation is a lot of these are from China. You could literally make it as a Word document and say it conforms, and they just stamp it with the rubber stamp and say it's good. It's very different than actually doing an analysis where you can actually see the spectra from different analytical methods. or from some type of third-party place, like we use Eurofins. Any type of analytical place will give you a more thorough analysis. So if these people are selling this, I would hope they've at least done that due diligence to show that it's 90%, 80%, 10%, whatever's being sold. Again, because what we've discussed before, one thing the evidence does show is what's being sold doesn't seem to be matching what actually is present in whatever supplement. So I think people need to do that due diligence. And if you want a really quick method, just break the capsule open and look at the color. If it's being sold as 90, 100% turkesterone and it's brown, you're definitely not getting what you're paying for, or what you think you're paying for.
That's great, Ben. Now, all the people out there have an ability to make sure they're getting 100%, or at least a high quality, high potency version of something that probably doesn't do anything. So that's good. Hey, so I was just thinking, what are some surface level questions people might have based upon this critique to throw some curveballs at our old DH here? That's designated hitter. I think I sported right there. Ben Esgro. So here's one that you'll often hear in discussions around, how anabolic steroids work. That you don't want estrogen to be too low. That is a myth. Estrogen has beneficial effects on hypertrophy, and you want estrogen almost as high as it will be as a byproduct of taking testosterone and testosterone derivatives, but just to the point where it doesn't give you problematic side effects. So therefore, what's the problem with this estrogen-mediated mechanism, even though it's not actually just an estrogen-mediated mechanism? What do you think about that, Ben? That might be some kind of YouTube comment we might have gotten if I hadn't said it already.
Yeah, so estrogen receptors are interesting. There's two subtypes, alpha and beta, and alpha seems to be associated with most of the unwanted effects of estrogen. Beta seems to be more strongly involved with bone, especially bone building. So different compounds will have different affinity for these subtypes, like we talked about a little bit previously. Some things are actually more general, meaning they bind to both, like the major circulating estrogen, estradiol, it binds to both, so it will activate the alpha and beta receptor. Some of the drugs that are given for cancer and bodybuilders use, like tamoxifen, are more selective. Tamoxifen is more selective towards estrogen receptor beta. That's partly why, again, I know some of these things because my mom has had breast cancer. She was on tamoxifen. She was on a lot of these SERMs and anti-estrogens for almost a decade. And that's why some of those things don't cause as dramatic impacts on bone mass as some of the stronger anti-estrogens do, because of that affinity for the different receptors. I think to answer the question directly, what we have, and this exists really, this is a universal concept. Like when we talk about toxicity, people like to have a black and white view of toxicity. The reality is the dose is what really matters the most. Like there's a normal range of dose before where something is safe and can be used actually medicinally, and then once it becomes dangerous and toxic. And that's true of everything, including water and macronutrients. And this spectrum exists as well for when we look at blood work and we look at circulating hormones. We have normal limits, which is a range that's basically population-wide, where we see that you don't seem to have dysfunctions if you're within these ranges. So it's very true. Like if you drive estrogen too low, you will definitely have negative effects, particularly on bone building, bone maintenance. Again, like I said, that's due to estrogen receptor beta. And then one of the things we do know about estrogen and skeletal muscle is it actually is very important for maintaining the plasma membrane and the ability to recover from damage. So it might not be as important for muscular growth, but definitely for muscle maintenance and keeping muscle cells healthy. Estrogen seems to be important for recovery. So I think if you're on the low end of the range, it's definitely a problem. If you're within normal limits, it shouldn't be. And then high, of course, you're outside of normal limits, and you will typically have a lot more dysfunctional things, like the classical things of higher risk for gyno, higher risk for different behavioral abnormalities, and probably fat mass and stuff like that. But again, it's important to realize that these receptors are spread throughout the body. So like, just like the androgen receptor is not just on muscle, estrogen receptors are not just in one place. They're in adipose tissue, they're in the brain, they're everywhere. So I'm sorry to tangent a little bit, but talk about, how that's important when you talk about drug development, why that's important. That's actually how the development of SARMs started, is what if we can selectively target androgen receptors that are just in muscle and provide an anabolic effect and not have the risks for prostate cancer and a lot of the androgenic associated things with traditional steroids. So yeah, I don't know. Hopefully that last little bit didn't make it confusing. But there's a lot of context to these things.
No, I think that's a great answer, because I think having higher levels of circulating estrogen is not the same thing as activating the estrogen receptor. So that was, my surface level understanding of the difference. But I knew there would be someone who would potentially have heard that.
Here's the other way to look at it as well, is like, if you want to go down the reasoning of why too much circulating is an issue and why too little is an issue, is basically you're talking about the probability to activate these receptors. And within a certain range, a certain dose going around your blood, you will occupy, let's just say, the optimal amount of estrogen receptors. Now, once there's more, you're more likely to activate receptors, overactivate them, or activate them in areas where you don't want to. So dose response is a very important aspect. And that's true, again, not just of endogenous hormones, of things like caffeine and everything else. So that's sort of the answer to why the normal range exists, because basically you'll have spillover into areas that you don't want to have it.
Totally makes sense to me. So we're going down the Steelman pathway even more. Okay, so could these bugroids help me increase my bone density via this mechanism?
That's a great question. I don't have an answer for it. What I've seen for the receptor studies, the receptor assays, is they're either done in mice or they're cell culture. From what we have, looking at circulating hormones from these two human studies, it really doesn't seem like we have any dramatic effect of either circulating estrogen or any markers of it having a dramatic role on changing physiology that would directly be related to those things. So it's very hard to say. I guess at this point, the evidence doesn't indicate that would happen, but I can't rule it out.
No, I think that's fair. And there's also, some other just minor points that I think are interesting when you look at tangentially related research. When you look at postmenopausal women who are doing resistance training, they're able to gain muscle. They don't seem to have different recovery capacities. And further, there's a pretty cool case study of two, I think one's an M1, one's an M2, and I might be a little bit off, powerlifters, elite level powerlifters, and they have some of the highest bone mineral densities ever recorded in women in the literature. And you would presume that potentially they're at least perimenopausal, especially the M2 lifter, which I think is pretty cool. So they definitely go against the grain of what you would expect to see. So anyway, that's something. And this is not Steelman-y. This is. Oh, you go ahead.
That's a really interesting thing to touch on, and I think it speaks to something that's extremely important, yet probably under-discussed when you get into talking about research studies, talking about pathways especially, and having been to a lot of these conferences like experimental biology, where people study a pathway for their whole life and then they only see everything through that pathway, is these things don't exist in isolation. So exactly what you talked about is like, there are other ways to activate bone mineral density, bone growth, osteoblasts, other than the estrogen receptor beta. Even when you activate it, there's ways to inactivate it that might work through a different type of pathway that isn't estrogen related, that actually has an impact, where you can almost negate that function. And that's where the complexity of both pharmacology and life, both ingesting compounds that can act at an array of receptors, or environmental factors like lifting, whatever environment you're doing, behavioral things, can all, act on certain receptors just through endogenous changes in hormones. So it is super complex. And I don't think that's a reason to throw up your hands and say, I give up. I think it's more so like people need to realize there is that shortcoming in like the possibility to maybe explain certain things is enhanced by understanding these. But at the same time, that's why we're still studying physiology, because we don't fully understand how this one interacts with another one and another one interacts. Like even when we talked about androgen receptor action with testosterone, the reality is like we don't have that pathway completely defined in terms of why if you have a mutation in the androgen receptor and you provide someone exogenous hormones, why they still actually get muscle growth. And it seems to be through that glucocorticoid receptor, but that's not fully elucidated. Like we know it, they act through the androgen receptor, but there's still so much to be uncovered. And I think that's why it's impossible for me to say, even in this conversation, it definitively, ecdysterone or ecdysteroids definitively don't work. I just think there's a lot more evidence right now against them than there is for them.
Yeah, specifically for ECDY, we have studies that we have that 06 study that suggests it does not. And then we have a 2019 study that suggests it does, but it's completely implausible based upon the dose, which makes you think it's probably sampling variance. So I would categorize that one as a almost certainly false positive null.
Yep.
But we don't have anything on turkesterone. However, you were saying earlier, and this is less of a steel man, but something that I have heard, and I'm going to repeat because it's from people I trust, but I have no experience with it. You mentioned that in a cell culture, when you have a muscle fiber, a muscle cell, I should say, in a growth medium, adding it to it results in growth, but unsure of why. I have heard some cell biologists and researchers I've talked to who have done this type of work, which I have not, again, say that you have to be really careful with these types of studies because if you add almost anything to cells in a growth medium, it sometimes results in cell growth. And that is a very different experiment than what would happen with cells incorporated into the full human organelles and organisms and in not in vitro,
For sure. At best, it's a surrogate marker. Just like at best, some of the assays we use for determining toxicity before something goes through all 3 clinical trials and it's approved as a drug, they're surrogates. They're usually a step in the process, but they're not the end-all, be-all. So typically it goes cell culture, animal, first in human. And that's why it doesn't just go cell culture, direct release as a pharmaceutical. We need to understand that there's definite shortcomings to using these things. The problem is with supplements, the funding in going through all those stage 3 trials. I mean, you're talking about the difference between being, $20+ million in the hole by the time you're launching something, which, let's just be honest, supplement companies don't have those kind of budgets. That's bigger than most, well-known supplement companies, their entire, gross sales in a year,
That's a really good point. And on that, we talked a little about this in our preliminary conversation. Let's plausibly go into La La Land for a moment and go. There is an unexplained, unknown mechanism by which ECDY and turkesterone do massively increase muscle growth, and it only takes 6 milligrams, not even the 100 that was supposed to be in the pill to do it.
Right.
Why would it be a supplement company that doesn't even have the budget to actually ensure the label claims are accurate and only has 1/17 of what's in it, that has discovered this, and not necessarily a pharmaceutical company that has billions of dollars in revenue that literally has been, like, again, you talked about SARMs. For over 20 years now, there has been a multi-million-dollar effort to develop SARMs because they're trying to get the effects of steroids without some of the side effects by having selective androgen receptor affinity. But there could be this magical avoid the androgen receptor altogether pathway to get those same effects, but pharmaceutical companies just missed the boat on that. Do you think that's a plausible thing, that it's actually Tom and Joe cooking up sups in their basement who figured it out?
I would love to believe that, because largely I think that admittedly small percentage of a chance that you can figure something out that hasn't been published about or funded by some major department. It's there, but it's so low. And I think the reality is, when we even talk about these cell culture studies, they're usually done in hopes of developing some API, some active pharmaceutical ingredient from it. So the fact that pharmaceutical companies have screened these compounds and departed from making a lead compound out of them, I think speaks volumes, because obviously that who more than the pharmaceutical company has a vested interest in releasing a new drug that's novel and that's widely available from plants. Because of course, if you can grow the plant and you can cultivate it, now you're talking about massive profit margin, because you don't need to do what's the term for it? Total synthesis, which means you're basically starting from one commercially available basic starting material and building it up one reaction at a time. You could take a plant and modify it through 2-3 synthetic steps, and you have your active ingredient. So I think it's extremely unlikely, but the fact that some of the products that we've made and released have done things that I'd say are unique. They're not unique to what drugs can do, but I think are unique. It makes me say that there's a very small wiggle room, but I don't think anybody can hold a candle to both university. Like, I would never claim to be as effective as a department of pharmacology. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think about most of the innovation that happens at the supplement company level, and it's normally someone taking known ingredients with known effects and using them in a synergistic manner.
And repurposing, yeah, 100%. I agree with that. And I think, again, admittedly, a lot of this stuff is intellectual entertainment for me, or mental masturbation, as they say in Fight Club. I'd like to believe that, someone can find Pandora's box. But again, oftentimes when I find some really interesting thing, it's because of an elucidated or a validated mechanism that a drug works on, and then I'm working backwards from the drug to find a plant that works on that same pathway. So I think that should speak volumes as well.
Yeah, I think it does. And I think if people, people are, they're well aware of the quote unquote war between the doping detection and the dopers. However, what maybe they have the misconception of is that these new anabolic compounds are being, discovered and used that can't be detected, like the clear, et cetera, et cetera. But what I don't think they understand, that the process by which these quote unquote new anabolics come out often involves digging back into stuff that was done in the 50s and 60s, and then figuring out what was already created as an anabolic, which has a potential effect on performance enhancement. And then how do I take that existing chemical structure and modify it in a way that won't be detected by the current? It's not like just this eureka moment of pulling out of my head.
So a lot of the novel stimulants that we know of, that we talked about in prior episodes, they were just straight up abandoned by the drug companies. For whatever reason, sometimes because they're not as high potency as they'd like, maybe they're just not as adapted well to a dosage form because they take on too much water. I don't know. There's many reasons why a company might abandon a lead. But oftentimes, these are published about, they are researched, and they're filed in a patent. So the drug company has a catch-all in the event that they might want to pursue those again in the future. The synthesis is completely laid out for you. So, as long as you can follow it along and you have the chemistry know-how, they've done a lot of the footwork for you. And since it's abandoned, it's not technically legislated, and it can be launched. That's largely what happened with a lot of prohormones is we knew that these modifications did this because, again, that's what the medicinal chemistry department in a drug company is doing, is they're looking at all these different leads and trying to find the most potent, safest one. So they'll abandon some that technically might be active, and they're just not scheduled as a drug. So
I want to say, man, I'm remembering very early on when I got into the bodybuilding scene, it might have been like the second gen post the initial andros, like M1 test, like MIT, M1T, like methyl 1 testosterone or whatever. That was a hugely popular over-the-counter, really it's a pro steroid, not a prohormone. But I didn't realize where that came from until I started digging into the history of anabolics when I got interested in some of the old school guys and the point at which, you know, you could realistically determine that pretty much everybody was natty, you know. And the very first studies where they started to clinically use an experiment with oral testosterone was methyl testosterone. And you look at every study on it, it's like it caused massive side effects. It's liver toxic. We abandoned it. They got out of there like in like 1942. They were like, "Oh, this is crazy. This is terrible." And there's even anecdotal accounts of some of the like East Coast bodybuilders in the very early 50s who experimented with it and were like, "This is terrible. Like, I feel awful. The side effects are horrible," and stopped doing it. So it's just funny that then that became like a pro steroid 60 years later, you know?
it is. And even, you know, when about 20 years pass, the patent expires, so they do become usable. And I think if you're a good patent excavator, and this is not to diminish Patrick, but I do know that many of the things he launched were from finding old patents and just synthesizing them and launching them himself. I think you could release some novel things, but I think you can have a pretty deep discussion about how say, like, basically the moral implications of that.
And I think it's just really, really telling that the entire meta discussion we're having now is supplement companies picking up abandoned projects of the pharmaceutical industry and then saying, "Hey, this is the next new thing that nobody's heard about, and it's going to have amazing effects," while some, you know, multi-billion-dollar revenue lifetime company is going, "Oh yeah, we realized that was crap in 1972."
Yeah. And, you know, we may see that change. I think what I mean specifically when I say that, so it can't be misinterpreted, is like, I think as pharma seems to get a more and more active role in supplements, we may see that change. But the reality is, it seems, at least, you know, if how it's been operating is any indication, it's just going to be more quality control on the things that already exist in the market. So, like, you know, the amino acids, the creatines, the caffeine and stuff. I don't know that we're going to get more of that blending, but I think that gray market's always going to exist, because I think there's always a demand for a drug that you can get more easily. Like, that works like crack.
Yeah.
Hey, so let me say, we have been as charitable as one can be. And I think you are already noticing the tonal shift in the conversation when it's like, okay, what is the current available research? What are theoretically the plausible mechanisms? And to me, I kind of feel we're currently in maybe 2011 when it comes to flexible dieting, or the idea that CICO is what's important. And some people are like, clean eating, like, I'm not saying, like, now 7 foods, where some of the people that are parroting, you know, the efficacy of like turkesterone or whatnot, they're like, well, we don't know. Like, they shifted from, like the anecdote, right? Like, oh my God, I've had people you wouldn't believe, right? And we could go down that rabbit hole. I don't think it helps, Eric, to your point, what you said about not being annoyed, but some of these things, I think it helps us to be smug. Like, that's not what I'm trying to do. I actually do believe genuinely some kids have gotten better results while using turkesterone, but due to the placebo effect of them believing this mythical thing. Go on, Eric.
Can we talk about
that study?
The studies.
Oh, yeah.
Where they give people placebo steroids.
Yeah. One of my favorite ones that Greg covered.
You
like
realize
years
that
ago.
happens in cancer studies too? Like,
yeah.
You can shift the outcome of the efficacy of cancer drugs by telling someone that it's a cancer drug when it's a placebo.
Ben,
like,
if I'm
belief
dying,
is
just lie to
incredible.
me, bro. Just lie to me. Just lie to me.
It's wild. Yeah. And I think, you know, that's something, like, if you really dig into the research on placebos, some of the meta research on it, we start to see that, like, I think if you were to just look at some of the kind of like quote unquote standard placebo-controlled trials in your stock standard supplements like creatine or caffeine, you can quantify that the mean effect of the placebo is potentially like 2 to 3%, right? But that is not to say that the placebo effect in all fields of study is homogeneous and it stops there. There are actually, there are some placebo effects that are better than other placebo effects. And I think the amount and the degree to which you can manipulate someone's belief is telling. And some of the placebo steroid studies have pretty crazy results. And I think it's because of what people expect from steroids. So if you can get people to expect something similar to steroids from a supplement, it is unsurprising to me that there are the anecdotes which are out there, which are very strong in favor of some of these things. So I agree overall. We don't want to be smug. We just need to be aware of the limitations of the influencer or the consumer experience.
And this is difficult because I don't want to go too deeply into it, but I think it's worth mentioning. I will leave out some details, but a lot of times when I read a study, especially on some medicinal natural product, like a supplement ingredient, potential supplement ingredient, and it just seems like it flies in the face of everything else that's out there and the defined, physiological function of these things or pathways, I'll email the lead researcher. And I've been looking at ways to extend the half-life of caffeine for quite a long time. I've talked about it, quite a bit over the past couple of years. And after doing a podcast, a company reached out to me saying that they had an active ingredient that did that. And first thing was, it was not accepted into a journal yet. It was a published abstract. So I was able to get access to the full text, like the pre-published full text. And I thought this flies in the face of everything I know about, how caffeine gets degraded and why this is going on. And so I emailed the researcher and I asked these very specific questions about, why does this not seem to be working? And I basically got the most generic response possible you can get on caffeine metabolism. And I think what needs to be recognized as well is, and I hate to say it to make people go too far in discrediting science because of funding, but the reality is sometimes if there's incentivization even in academia to publish a certain finding. Now, I do routinely go back and check to see if that's been accepted into a journal and published, and to my knowledge, it still hasn't been. But I think it's fascinating and almost even more reason why it does help to have those additional questions other than just what's published out there and what has the data set said. I think you do need that second layer of skepticism of is this logical? Whether you understand pathways or not, does this logically seem like we talked about before with, we talked about prior to the call with myostatin inhibitors, does it seem logical that this would be a breakthrough treatment for people with Duchenne muscular dystrophy and pharmaceutical companies would have a vested interest in releasing this follistatin supplement and a supplement company's coming out with it before, a pharmaceutical company? It just flies in the face of logic, right? So I think, I think it's very tempting to buy into the hype, but at the same time, you can probably save yourself a lot of money by going down some of those lines of questioning that you might ignore in the beginning when you're getting the marketing message.
Eric, can we, I want to coin a new term where we spoke about plausible mechanism necessary for science in order to think, okay, is this worth investigating? It's plausible marketing, I think, honestly, for turkesterone when you think about it. And what I mean for the average person, it sounds sexy. And I really do think that eclipses everything else when you have a lack of available, let's say, counter arguments that are, shooting from the hip. So this podcast, it'll get 30,000 downloads or whatnot. So no one's going to discredit some of the potential, the lack of potential mechanisms. Okay. And then that study, it's only one study. Those are the easy things to parrot, right? And then immediately those are like arrows shot down. Okay. So then they go, it's like, but how does this sound? And I'm not even like from a marketing standpoint, this is exactly how it works. So Ben, here,
what's the angle? How do I spin this?
So it's like, let's talk about this now from a marketing standpoint. It's like everything you said, Ben, is entirely logical. Okay, so straight up, turkesterone starts with the T, just like testosterone. It's there's human compounds, hormones, but what about there's a bug, there's a plant compound? Wait a sec, that sounds intriguing. I swear to you, if it wasn't turkesterone, if it started with like an S, sermesterone, let's just say it was that, it would probably have sold like 1/5 as much, because immediately it sounds like something you heard that's dangerous already, so you have an association with it. Then once again, the plausibility of the marketing, where it's like, well, those, like you can't take those because those are technically illegal. Now, these aren't those, but they operate in the same way, because by proxy, it sounds like the same thing. And that's just like how it works on someone's brain. And before you know it, because they wanted to be true, I think this is the other undercover thing about a lot of marketing. It's uncovering hidden desires. Because if we're to say right now, let's just say right now, like full disclosure, and I'm curious, maybe the call, like we're at the end of the conversation, but like for those that respond on YouTube, if you knew you could use a compound that had no negative sides, so you talked about, Ben, the toxicity, how it checked out, and all these other things, it doesn't have the sides of regular anabolic hormones, but it has most of the benefits, DECA level, like almost there, like damn near. It's like, would you take it? The answer is of course. So that then becomes prepackaged what is actually being talked about, and that then just becomes the common discourse. And that's why I do think it is important to try and platform, like having Ben on to talk about it, to really go down both the rabbit holes, and not to also, to your point, because I hate reductionism to the point where you lose all fidelity. It was like, see, like science doesn't know all the answers. Like, well, someone funded that study, so you mean to tell me that like just some of the conclusions that are drawn that are paper thin from some of the conversations, like, man, you can't reduce some of these conversations down to talking to like a sound bite. And unfortunately, I do think we're in the generation where it's the headline, it's the sound bite. So you need like the neat, sexy answer. And oftentimes the shortest answer has to be the sexiest one. So it's like, Ben, it's great that you talked for an hour and a half. You went into pharmacology. It's like, here's something like, I'm not even joking. Not the Iron Cult audience, but let's say if Joe Rogan's entire audience just had to listen to this, like all of a sudden Joe got abducted by the aliens that he so dearly loves, and this episode was shown, and like people had heard about turkesterone. I'm willing to believe like probably 40% by then. It's like, would you try it still? It's like, yeah, fuck it, why not, right? Like I think we're
definitely. Well, and that's why I wanted to mention that, because I acknowledge that based upon that, of people knowing that it's safe, they will approach it that way. And I think, if you want a soundbite, the reality is I want to believe all those things. I want to believe that they're true. I want to believe that we have stumbled into some type of new active, active anabolic that doesn't work or impact, hormones the way that steroids do. But I'm just not willing to stop there and say, I want to believe it, and I'm going to dive right down in. Yeah. I think what's fascinating, as a really quick aside, is like there are some really interesting people with in-depth knowledge of pharmacology that Joe has had on there, like Hamilton Morris, who I think he's brilliant, and the conversation flows very differently when he's on. So that would be very fascinating to have that conversation. I just think because of what seems to rise to the top oftentimes and make it from the fitness industry onto his podcast, the more sensationalized things tend to get the most attention,
No. Absolutely.
Eric, I was going to say just very briefly on that too, when we talk about like the plausible mechanism, plausible marketing, how does it sound, and then how does someone digest this? It's always interesting to me when things shoot off, right? Like we're kind of, I think in the space, you're almost expecting it, if that makes sense. In the supplement field, where there is going to be that X thing, it will take a new form. It's a new permutation. It's the same dream. So it's like you're hearing the thing. And I think that's maybe, to me, one of the biggest dangers is that like a scientist, in quotations, won't speak with certainty with things that you can't say. Like there's just not enough evidence, and you're trying to disconfirm certain things. And that's dangerous because a marketer speaks with certainty. So you're saying like, we don't know yet. Like, you know what I'm saying, Ben? Like Ben's saying like, we don't know yet. We don't have enough. We don't think so. Let's see, we await further research and other potential viable mechanisms being proposed. And then a marketer is like, it's working. You know what I mean? That's and that's hard. It's hard to overcome because you basically have to not bastardize science, but like in order to combat against that, against like raw conviction of something people want to hear versus the truth. Ooh, tough.
Yeah.
And it is a known and repeated and regularly used strategy in supplement marketing to operate on the fringes of what's known.
Yeah.
Because you are immune, just based on the way the scientific community is, to an outright critique which can totally dismantle what you have. And also you can operate off of the fringe science that exists, whether that is lab culture, cell culture studies, or animal research, or that one false positive. But there's not enough evidence yet to disprove it. So you know you're somewhat not going to catch the heat from the evidence-based crowd. And then you can operate with those, existing desires for there to be the next super supplement. And you have a relatively ironclad argument for at least a while. You're going to get enough to get a few good runs and run a profit. And that's ultimately...
And that's why I think we see those waves.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think we see the wave and then the thing kind of disappears to relative obscurity. But you're right. And I think one of the most fascinating things that we've certainly experienced both together and prior I did as well with trying to almost lead people to the water of questioning what they're presented in marketing is oftentimes you are questioned by challenging someone's preconceived convictions of like if you say beta-alanine is not as strong or as large an effect as you think and you're being sold, people will more often believe the marketing and fight you when you're the one trying to educate them, not trying to sell them something. I think that's so ironic, and it does present a really interesting uphill battle to educating within the space, particularly with supplements.
I totally agree. And I think there is some value in just pointing out the cyclical nature of it, because if you take a look at the level of enthusiasm that is typically expressed at each one of the peaks of these cycles, it is very much a message that this is going to change everything. That's right. And if that is true, if this supplement or this diet or this whatever is going to change everything, but this is the second, third, or 18th time that it's come around, we know that at least is false. At best, it is going to have a much smaller effect than would have been proposed. I think actually, like the ketogenic diet, there's a good example here. Like it's had its recent comeback, but the Atkins diet was huge in the late 90s, early 2000s. And if it really was going to be the nail in the coffin of the obesity epidemic, we wouldn't need of it to come back around now, because back in 2001, we would have all gone, oh, wow, this is magic.
Not enough people
it
were
does
doing
do
that,
everything
bro.
people say.
See, that's the problem. Not enough people were doing it.
But what have we seen? I think which speaks completely to your point is what have we actually seen that has run in tandem with that is marketing has dramatically increased of keto-friendly things, keto-friendly options, marketing budgets. There's more MLM companies selling keto-type products. So I think it's just fascinating, like you said, is just more money has been funneled towards that because of some interesting findings with ketogenic diets and ketosis on certain disease states.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, this isn't the first time ECDY and turkesterone have been bantied around. And it probably won't be the last, I think, if we're all being honest.
There's many ecdysteroids, so this may be one of many we will be talking about in the next 20 years.
Yeah, see you in 8 years, Ben, to talk about the next one.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is a really fascinating conversation. I think we covered a lot of ground. We very briefly reviewed the fact that there is really an absence of evidence and no findings suggesting that there's an absence of evidence for turkesterone, and that's we got to be honest with that. But we do have some limited available evidence on ECDY, ecdysterone, that is arguably null, suggesting it doesn't do anything. And in addition to that, we've gone a step further. We've discussed what are the potential mechanisms for these compounds? And right now, all of the proposed mechanisms, which is about as strong of a statement as we can make, fall short. There's no effect on the androgen receptor, and the estrogen receptor it does have an effect on is not associated with any kind of anabolic outcomes or performance-enhancing things when we look at far stronger compounds that act on that same receptor. So right now, unless there is a yet unknown or undiscovered mechanism, which is not impossible, but it's just highly implausible considering these were abandoned by pharmaceutical companies already, maybe spend your money elsewhere, you know?
Yep.
And even if you do spend money, like you said, Ben, because, hey, it's safe, and why the hell not? Maybe you're going to take that lottery shot and hope for the big bucks, at least to make sure that you're not getting brown powder that's only about 6% of the thing you actually think you're getting.
If that. So interesting, very small fact there is in at least that Arjuna Turkestana or Turkestanica, when I said it's relatively abundant in ecdysteroids, the ecdysteroids account for roughly 1% of the dry weight. So that means that it's relatively abundant, which means it's very, very low. So if you're just getting a crude powder of that, you're definitely not getting what's stated. If you're getting that brown powder, yeah, it's going to be very, very low in ecdysteroids.
Tom and Joe don't care. They're just going to tell you to take the whole bottle in one go and then buy another one. They're out there just in a garden, just digging up roots and chopping it up and put it into pills. You know, they don't care.
Man.
So yeah, just consider all of these things. Consider what it means. The fact that this supplement has been, a craze cyclically, that maybe it couldn't possibly be that major of an effect if the anecdotes didn't actually last long enough to make it something like a creatine or a caffeine or an anabolic steroid. And then moving forward, dig a little bit. You don't need to do much into the mechanism of action. Is it plausible? Is there a reason why we should even be investigating the given supplement in the first place, regardless of the findings in the applied literature? So hopefully this gives you another tool in your tool belt, folks, and saves you a little bit of money.
Mm-hmm.
Ben, let me ask you this, my dude. Where can people find you? This is your third or fourth time on the podcast. Definitely at least the third. I know that.
I think it's the fourth. Yeah,
It's got to be the
so
fourth.
Too. Yeah, let's get me over whatever 3100K on Instagram. So it's at Ben Esgro on Instagram. If people like this type of stuff, I have another page called Subsci that I've been attempting, as we discussed, to do a better job communicating information and education on supplements and some of these whys and questions and ways you can formulate some of those that logic to more critically assess supplements. So yeah, those two channels will be the main ones, at Ben Esgro, at Subsci.
Amazing. Well, I will just say it's fantastic having you on. As always, thank you so much to everyone for listening to another episode of Iron Culture. We'll link all that in the description. You could go ahead, leave a rating and review on iTunes. You know it has to be 5 stars, and I'll see everyone. We'll see all of you in that next episode every single Monday.